There are a lot of ways to make money off a piece of land: cattle, hay, mineral rights, hunting leases, but I bet most folks have never gotten paid because somebody built a walking trail across their property without permission. Every month I still get a check because of that trail, and every time I open the envelope I can't help but laugh, because the people writing those checks spent months telling everyone I was the unreasonable one. What makes it even funnier is that the whole mess could have been avoided with a single phone call. Just one. My name is Wade Mercer, and a few years ago I owned about 80 acres outside a little town called Cedar Bluff, Texas. Nothing fancy. No gated entrance, no stone monuments, no neighborhood committees holding meetings about mailbox colors. Just pasture, cattle, mesquite trees, and enough open sky to remind you how small your problems really are. My grandfather bought that land back in 1961 after returning from military service. He spent years clearing brush by hand, fixing fences himself, and slowly turning rough country into a working ranch. Growing up, I heard those stories so many times I could practically see them happening. Grandpa always said land wasn't something you owned. It was something you borrowed from the people who came before you and protected for the people who came after. Maybe that's why what happened bothered me so much. It wasn't just about dirt. It was about respect. The trouble started with a subdivision called Willow Creek Estates. They'd been built about 3 years before all this happened, right along my northern boundary. Nice houses, nice landscaping, lots of folks moving in from bigger cities looking for a quieter life. For the most part, we stayed out of each other's way. I'd wave if I saw somebody jogging near the fence. Some of them would stop and ask questions about the cattle. Kids liked watching the calves in spring. It wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful. Then the HOA board changed. You know how that goes. One election later, and suddenly people start acting like they're running a small country. The new HOA president was a guy named Bradley Henshaw, retired corporate executive, always dressed like he was headed to a golf tournament, always talking about property values and community enhancements. Every time I saw him, he seemed to have another grand vision for the neighborhood: walking paths, decorative landscaping, community gathering spaces. The kind of projects that sound great until somebody else gets stuck paying for them. About 6 months before everything blew up, Bradley stopped by my place. We stood by the fence talking while I fixed a gate hinge. He looked toward the back corner of my property and said, "You ever think about doing anything with that section back there?" I remember wiping grease off my hands and saying, "Yeah, I let cows walk on it." He laughed. I didn't. Then he started talking about connecting green spaces, improving recreational access, creating a more attractive environment. It sounded less like a conversation and more like a sales presentation. Eventually, I told him that corner of the ranch was staying exactly the way it was. Natural, undeveloped. End of discussion. He smiled, shook my hand, and said he understood. Looking back, that smile should have worried me. A month later, I headed down to Houston for a rodeo event. Nothing unusual. 5 days away from home. I left cattle feed instructions with my ranch hand, packed a bag, and hit the road. The last thing I saw when I pulled out of the driveway was the same view I'd seen 1,000 times: tall grass moving in the wind, deer tracks cutting through the dirt, and a narrow cattle path winding across that back corner of the ranch. 5 days later, I came home. It was late afternoon. The sun was hanging low, throwing long shadows across the pasture. I turned my truck onto the property and immediately noticed something felt off. At first, I couldn't figure out what it was. Then I saw a flash of black through the grass. Fresh asphalt. My stomach tightened. I drove farther, and the entire thing came into view. A paved walking trail. Not a temporary path. Not survey markings. An actual finished trail complete with wooden railings, benches, decorative lanterns, and landscaping. It curved across my property like it had always belonged there. For a few seconds, I honestly thought I was looking at the wrong piece of land. Then I spotted my grandfather's old fence line running right beside it, and reality hit me like a brick. Somebody had built an entire community trail across my ranch while I was gone. I sat there behind the steering wheel for a solid minute, engine still running, just staring at it. The strangest part wasn't the trail itself. It was how finished everything looked. Somebody had planned this, surveyed it, hired contractors, ordered materials, scheduled crews, poured asphalt, installed benches, put up decorative lights. None of that happens overnight. This wasn't a mistake. This was a decision. I climbed out of the truck and walked the length of the trail, feeling my blood pressure rise with every step. Fresh tire tracks from construction equipment still marked the dirt nearby. New cedar posts lined both sides. Somebody had even planted ornamental shrubs along sections of the path. It looked like something out of a glossy real estate brochure. The farther I walked, the angrier I got. By the time I reached the far end, I was already imagining dragging my bulldozer out there and turning the whole thing into a pile of broken asphalt. But anger has a funny way of making people stupid, and my grandfather taught me years ago that the best response isn't always the fastest one. Sometimes the smartest move is letting the other guy think he's winning while you quietly figure out how much his victory is going to cost him. That evening I called my ranch hand, Eddie. Did you know about this? I asked. There was a long pause. Wade, I figured you did. Why would I know about a walking trail somebody built on my land? Another pause. Because they acted like they had permission. That answer stuck with me. They acted like they had permission. Not because they had it. Because they assumed nobody would question them. The next morning I started digging. First stop was the Willow Creek Estates website. Sure enough, right there on the front page was a smiling family walking along the trail. The headline read, "New nature path now open for residents." I clicked through half a dozen photos. Parents pushing strollers. Joggers wearing expensive fitness watches. Dogs on leashes. One picture even had my cattle grazing in the background. My cattle. My land. Their advertisement. I almost laughed. Then I found the monthly HOA newsletter. That pushed me over the edge. There were 3 full pages celebrating the project. Bradley Henshaw had written an entire letter congratulating the board for creating a premium recreational amenity that would increase property values and improve resident satisfaction. Not one sentence mentioned permission from neighboring landowners. Not one sentence mentioned ownership. It was as if my ranch simply didn't exist. That's when I called Charlie Benson. Charlie was the county surveyor and one of the few men I trusted completely. He'd known my family for years. 2 days later, he arrived with GPS equipment, boundary maps, and enough documentation to settle any argument before it started. We spent the entire morning walking property lines. Every corner marker, every fence reference, every legal description. By lunchtime, Charlie looked up from his equipment and shook his head. Well, if there's good news, it's that this one's easy. Easy? I asked. Every inch of that trail is on your property. Every inch. Every single one. He wasn't exaggerating. The trail didn't barely cross the line. It wasn't a few feet over by accident. The entire section had been built squarely inside my property boundary. Somebody either ignored the survey data completely or never bothered checking it in the first place. Charlie painted bright orange boundary marks across the area and documented everything with GPS coordinates. Photos, measurements, reports, the kind of paperwork judges love. After that, I drove straight into town and visited my attorney, Raymond Cooper. Ray was pushing 70, wore old cowboy boots to court, and had a reputation for making arrogant people regret meeting him. He listened quietly while I explained everything. Then I handed him the survey report. He adjusted his glasses and spent several minutes studying the documents. Finally, he leaned back and smiled. "You know what amazes me?" he said. "What's that?" "How often people spend thousands of dollars on construction before spending $500 on legal advice." By the end of the meeting, we'd prepared trespassing claims, property damage claims, and formal notices demanding immediate action. Ray wasn't interested in making emotional arguments. He preferred mathematics, property value impact, unauthorized construction, commercial benefit, liability exposure. Numbers tend to scare people more than anger ever will. The following morning, workers arrived at my ranch with a steel gate I'd ordered the day before. We installed it exactly where the trail crossed into the most heavily used section. Then I mounted a large sign above it. Private property. Trail closed. Trespassers will be prosecuted. By noon, my phone was exploding. Residents were confused. Some were angry. Others genuinely had no idea the land belonged to someone else. Around 3 o'clock, a black SUV came flying up my driveway. Bradley Henshaw stepped out before the vehicle had fully stopped. His face was so red I thought he might pass out. "What in the world do you think you're doing?" he shouted. I took another sip of iced tea and stayed seated on the porch. "Afternoon, Bradley. You're blocking community access." "No, I'm controlling access to my property. That trail belongs to Willow Creek Estates." "Funny. County records disagree." He marched up the steps. "We've invested substantial money into that project." "Then maybe you should have checked where you were investing it." For the next 20 minutes, he threw every argument he could think of at me. Community benefit, shared interests, economic value, neighborhood improvement. Every sentence boiled down to the same thing. They wanted the trail. They'd already spent the money. Therefore, I should just accept it. Finally, I walked inside, grabbed the survey map, and spread it across the porch table. I pointed at the bright orange markings. See this? I asked. That's my property. Then I pointed at the trail. And that's your problem. For the first time all afternoon, he stopped talking. His eyes moved across the map. He knew. Maybe he hadn't known before. Maybe he had. Either way, he knew now. This isn't over, he said. You're right, I replied. It's just getting started. He left furious. I watched the SUV disappear down the driveway and suddenly felt calm for the first time in days. The legal process would take time. Maybe months. Maybe longer. But then another idea started forming in my head. A much better idea. See, everyone assumed I wanted the trail gone. Truth was, once I cooled off, I didn't really care about the trail itself. Asphalt wasn't the problem. Entitlement was. The more I thought about it, the more I realized destroying the trail would actually let the HOA off easy. They'd apologize, remove it, pay some settlement, and move on. No lesson learned. No lasting consequence. Then I remembered something my grandfather used to say whenever neighbors borrowed equipment without asking. If somebody enjoys using your property that much, son, maybe they ought to contribute to the upkeep. I started laughing right there on the porch, because suddenly I could see the whole thing. The trail wasn't a problem anymore. It was an opportunity. 3 days later, I bought a commercial turnstile gate from a county fair supplier. Eddie thought I'd lost my mind. You serious? He asked while helping unload it. Dead serious. We spent an entire afternoon installing it at the main trail entrance. Then I commissioned a large metal sign. The wording took me longer than the construction. I wanted it perfect. Simple. Direct. Impossible to misunderstand. When the sign finally arrived, I bolted it above the gate myself. Red Cedar Ranch Walking Trail. $10 per person per entry. Cash only. No exceptions. The next morning I parked my truck nearby and waited. Around 6:30 the first jogger arrived. She slowed down, stared at the sign, looked around as if hidden cameras might appear. Then she read it again. A few minutes later 2 more residents showed up. Then a family with a stroller. Then several dog walkers. Nobody knew what to do. Some laughed. Some complained. One guy actually walked back to his car, grabbed a $10 bill, and paid. By lunchtime, photos of the toll gate were all over the neighborhood social media groups. By evening, the entire subdivision was in chaos. And somewhere deep down, I had a feeling Bradley Henshaw was having the worst week of his life. The chaos only got worse from there. By the end of the first week, Willow Creek Estates looked less like a luxury subdivision and more like a community in open revolt. Residents flooded HOA meetings demanding answers. Some were angry at me, sure, but a whole lot more were angry at the people who had created the mess in the first place. The board had spent months promoting the trail as their crown jewel, their big accomplishment, the thing that supposedly justified all those association fees. Now, every morning people were standing in front of a turnstile trying to decide whether a walk was worth $10. What made it even funnier was that I wasn't forcing anyone to use it. There were public sidewalks all over town. Nobody needed my trail. They just wanted it because they'd already been told it belonged to them. Funny how that works. People get attached to something real quick when they think they're entitled to it. About 10 days after the gate went up, Ray called me. You sitting down? He asked. Depends. The HOA wants to negotiate. I leaned back in my chair and smiled. Already. Apparently their board meetings have become very entertaining. A few days later we met at a conference room in town. Bradley was there along with 2 board members and their attorney. Nobody looked happy. Gone was the confident executive who had stormed onto my porch demanding compliance. This version looked tired, stressed, like a man who hadn't enjoyed a peaceful cup of coffee in weeks. Their attorney started talking about finding a reasonable solution. That's lawyer language for we know we're losing and we'd like to stop the bleeding. They asked me to remove the toll gate. I said no. They asked me to lower the fee. I said no. They asked me to consider community goodwill. I nearly laughed out loud. Community goodwill would have been asking permission before paving my land. After nearly an hour of going in circles, I slid a document across the table. Bradley looked down at it. What's this? Your solution. It was a lease agreement. Simple. Clean. $1,000 per month. Unlimited access for residents. Miss a payment and access ends immediately. No debates. No exceptions. The room went quiet. One board member whispered something under his breath. Another rubbed her forehead like she was developing a headache. Bradley stared at the document for a long time. You're turning our trail into a business. I shook my head. No, I'm turning my property into a business. You turned it into a trail. For the first time since this whole thing started, nobody had a comeback. Because there wasn't one. The facts were the facts. The land belonged to me. The construction had happened without permission. The residents wanted access. And now there was a price attached to that access. 2 weeks later, the signed agreement arrived in my mailbox along with the first payment. I remember standing in my kitchen holding that check and thinking about my grandfather. The old man would have laughed himself silly. Not because of the money. $1,000 a month wasn't life-changing. What mattered was the principle. For months, a group of people had acted as though ownership was optional, as though boundaries only mattered when they were convenient. Now those same people were paying rent for the privilege of using something they once tried to take for free. Over time, things settled down. Residents went back to enjoying their walks. The HOA quietly stopped bragging about the project. Bradley finished out his term and eventually moved away. Last I heard, he sold his house and relocated to Arizona. Whether that had anything to do with the trail controversy, I honestly couldn't say. Though if I were a betting man, I'd wager those monthly meetings weren't helping his blood pressure. As for me, I kept the agreement exactly as it was. Every month a check arrived. Every month I deposited it. Sometimes I'd drive past the trail in the evening and watch families walking under the lanterns they installed. Kids riding bikes. Couples pushing strollers. Dogs chasing squirrels. The funny thing is, I eventually stopped being angry about the trail itself. The path wasn't the problem. The attitude behind it was. Once that got corrected, everything else became a lot easier to live with. Even now, years later, people occasionally ask if I regret not tearing the whole thing out. The answer is always the same. No. A bulldozer would have destroyed the trail in a single afternoon. That would have felt good for about 5 minutes. What happened instead taught a lesson that lasted a whole lot longer. Every time that HOA writes another check, they're reminded that property lines exist for a reason. Respect exists for a reason. And sometimes the cheapest way to do something is simply to ask first. Looking back, I don't think this story is really about a walking trail at all. It's about what happens when people confuse convenience with permission. It's about the assumption that somebody else's land, time, effort, or resources can be used without consequence. Most of all, it's about the fact that you don't always need revenge to win. Sometimes all you need is patience, paperwork, and a better idea than the person standing across from you. So now I'm curious what you think. If you came home and discovered an HOA had built something on your property without asking, would you have bulldozed it immediately, demanded it be removed, or done exactly what I did and charged them for every single step? Let me know down in the comments because I've seen people argue both sides of this one for years, and honestly, I still enjoy hearing the debate. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes a property line is just a suggestion. Chances are, they might learn something from this one.